This time on Poll Hub, losing faith. Ever since the Vietnam War and Watergate, pollsters have been asking Americans how much faith they have in their institutions. Institutions like organized religion, the military, police, Congress, big business, the White House. And it's probably fair to say that America was built on not trusting institutions. King George would be happy to grouse about that if he were still here. But some institutions seem pretty critical to our democratic experiment succeeding, like faith in the honesty of elections, for instance. Well, kids, maybe we should start getting worried. This is Poll Hub. Let's get started. And hi, everybody. I'm DeDapper. Welcome to Poll Hub. With us today,
Lee Miringoff, director of the Marist Institute for Public Opinion, and
Barbara Carvalho, director of the Marist Poll.
And we're talking about a crisis in faith today. That meant something different in the 80s. The religious right used to use that about America not being pious enough, but it's really something totally different now, and it's about institutions and this crisis in faith of our institutions. There's two things about that I'm curious about. One is, what is an institution? When you guys do these polls, and you have a big poll out here in the month of July that got a lot of coverage about the faith in institutions. So one is, what is an institution? The other is, why do we care? What are the institutions that you asked about, and what are Americans thinking about them?
Well, we think of institutions as actually the fabric that keeps our society and our culture together. It's kind of the rules that we all play by, whether they're formal or informal. So we asked people what they thought of specific institutions, such as the courts, the Congress, the media, our intelligence community.
And public opinion polls.
We even asked about public opinion polls, mind you, to people who are being asked a public opinion poll. And what we found is that there is really a lack of confidence, a lack of trust in these formal institutions, not necessarily organizations, but the way we've organized ourselves as a society. And I think most critical is that we found that people even don't think elections are fair. And I think for a democracy, that's a really big deal.
Take a look at some of these numbers, Lee. The most trusted institution in the poll that you did is the intelligence community, CIA and FBI.
Yeah. Not when I was in college.
Right. So when Gallup started asking questions, the Church Commission, which now we're going way back, but basically this was an investigation by Senator Frank Church of Idaho, led by Senator Frank Church, that basically tore open what the CIA had been doing. And the CIA could not have been highly rated at that time. How is it that we've come over all of these years to the point where we most trust the spies?
Yeah, well, somebody's got to keep the order going, and those are the folks who right now are being given that. But, even there, we're talking 60% having a great deal or a good amount of trust. So we're not like saying 80s or 90s in terms of the percentiles of people overwhelmingly endorsing these institutions. So everybody's taking a hit. The problem is that everybody else is taking a bigger hit. As the numbers start to descend to the 30s and the...
Well, Gallup started doing this right after Vietnam and Watergate, and specifically Watergate. They started in the early 70s looking at specific institutions in our society. So, for instance, they looked at, they took government institutions like the courts. And what we find is, although there has been some deterioration in people's trust in the courts, it's still pretty close to being the same as it was during that time.
You're at 60% in your poll of people that have a great deal or a good amount of faith in the courts. I mean, that's somewhat reassuring, because if you don't have faith in an independent judiciary,
and a rule of law.
Yeah, and a rule of law, we have a banana republic.
Yeah,
not the clothing store.
The Supreme Court doesn't have an army to enforce its policies and its decisions. So you're stuck having to have that legitimacy, that credibility, that faith.
So
but
what
I would
has
say
changed
that,
over that time?
I think big time has been Congress. In our latest poll, we have people saying that they have a great deal or a good amount of confidence in Congress at about 29%. That means 7 in 10 people don't have confidence in Congress. And if you look, a couple of generations ago, that number was much higher. It probably was considered low at the time, because it was in the 40s, and another 35% at least saying some. But comparatively, it was probably thought of as low no one ever thought we could get down to single digits.
To paraphrase the current president, a lot of people just don't think we're winning much anymore. So when it comes to the government and Washington, there's not a lot of problems getting solved. But I'd like to, as the elder statesman of the group here, go back to when I was in college, way back when.
I actually have the numbers here from when you were in college.
Well, thank you very much. We'll get to that momentarily. I don't want to give the dates away exactly, but, people thought that presidents didn't lie. This is pre-Vietnam, pre-Watergate.
Well, they didn't think that they lied to us.
That's correct. So we had a confidence and a trust in them. We might disagree with the policies, but we didn't disagree with the institutions or the people necessarily who were making those policies. The most trusted person in America during that period? Walter Cronkite, an anchor from mainstream media. Wake me up. You wouldn't say that today. So we've really done a flip in terms of the media, in terms of elections, as Barb indicated, in terms of who is seen as legitimate. That soft fabric of democracy has tethered.
Look, as a comparison, in your poll, the Trump administration had a good deal or a good amount of trust is 37%, and the media is 30%. So to your point, when Gallup started doing these polls, and we're in the mid-70s, Walter Cronkite has the faith of a vast majority of people in America. And the president, even though Nixon at that time probably didn't, obviously, there was at least faith in the institutions of government to be able to do the right thing. And that has essentially disappeared.
I mean, you were talking probably almost 8 in 10 Americans having at least some trust in newspapers and television. And that really has collapsed at this point.
So how much, in looking at the numbers, does this have to do with who's a Democrat and who's a Republican?
Well, there's no doubt. If you win, you tend to like the rules and how they were applied. If you lose, you don't. But I think the whole thing has been going south to some degree.
And how much of that has to do with what has happened since the 80s with the Republican Party basically saying that the government is not necessarily a bad thing, but something that is a problem more than a solution. I think it's fair to say the Republican Party has been organized around that principle that the government is part of the problem, not part of the solution, and therefore there's been a lot of attacks on the government's institutions. Yeah. How much of that has to?
Well, I think that the anger has come from that side of the political spectrum, and the Tea Party not being removed from that at all. Now the anger's coming, the resistance a little bit from the other side.
Well, but I think it also stems from people's own experiences too, because we look at the decline in trust and confidence in the public schools. That has really collapsed, over these decades. We look at the medical profession. In 1975, again, 8 in 10 Americans, 80%, had confidence in the medical profession, and now that number is down to about 4 in 10. So it's really collapsed, and I think that has to do with a lot of trust, not just in government, but in, again, these other institutions. There's been a decline in banking, in big business. So I think that it permeates throughout our culture. And so I'm not sure there's any, one, party, one, institution that is to blame.
Yeah, there's no one culprit. And it might be easy to say, well, Donald Trump has done this, but Donald Trump hasn't done this. This is what's been going on. Although, when it comes to civility, 70% think that has decreased, worsened, since Donald Trump has become president. So there is something to be laid at his doorstep in these numbers as well.
So one of the things people talk about that they worry about with the disillusion in institutions is that you have chaos and you turn into countries like, Somalia, failed state, or something like that. But you don't really have to look overseas to foreign countries or to the past too far to see where we've had cases in America where there's been a real lack of trust in institutions. You can just look, for instance, at New York City, where we all grew up in the New York area, and in the 70s, Ford to the city dropped dead. It was going to go bankrupt. The police, with the Serpico investigation and everything else, there was no faith in the police, and crime was out of control. Corporations were leaving. They're moving their headquarters to the suburbs. And then fast forward to the 90s, even though New York had recovered somewhat, I was covering New York and crime and politics in the 90s when the highest murder rates in New York history were happening, and people did not believe that New York was a survivable city, that it could be recovered.
And it has.
Right, but the faith in institutions was really low at that point. How did we get, and now how did we get to the point where New York is kind of the shiny city on the hill in some ways? I mean, the transit system maybe right now people don't think so, but there's been this vast recovery that everybody wants to live there. The economy has boomed. Things have really turned around. Not necessarily the faith in institutions, but if you were to poll there, my guess is that it would be higher than it was in the 90s, certainly higher than in the 70s. How'd that happen?
And certainly for the city itself. And I think part of it is leadership. I mean, we had very different leadership in the city. We had, believe it or not, Rudy Giuliani, and we had Bill Clinton at the national level, both of them driving the economy that made the city much more livable.
Well, and both of them also, between the Safe Streets, Safe Cities program that was part of the Clinton administration, and David Dinkins had started that, but then Giuliani fulfilled that and pushed out all those police officers into the streets. That really restored faith and confidence in the ability to have control, to have some control over civic society.
And he brought businesses back to the city, which made it viable.
Right, so they come back as well. Isn't it ironic that Bill Clinton and Rudy Giuliani, two of the more polarizing figures in politics from the 90s, and probably the most similar to our current president, are the ones who actually were at least partially responsible for turning around faith in institutions in one place, New York City?
Because they were directed at the policies in the cities and the country, whereas right now we're seeing a very different kind of modus operandi, if I could use that expression.
So there's hope?
There's always hope.
So.
There's always hope. The fabric has to, we'd have to restitch a little bit, but we can move forward.
One of the things we just talked about was the fact that public opinion polls are viewed by the majority of Americans as no more trustworthy or barely any more trustworthy than the media or Congress. A lot of people say, well, that's 2016. It all happened in 2016. Fake polls, fake news, failed polls. What really happened? You guys are on the inside.
Well, clearly there was a lot of surprise in 2016 because there was an expectation publicly that Hillary Clinton was likely to win. But when we look at the election, we're looking at it as a very different story being told by the pollsters than was being told by the forecasters, the 538s and the Huffington Posts of the world, who were aggregating polls, but they were putting their own special sauce on them. So when people heard things like Hillary Clinton had a 98% chance of being elected, people assumed that that was the polls talking. Well, the polls weren't really saying that. The polls were saying, in essence, that the race was close and getting closer. Our final poll at Marist had Hillary Clinton up by 1 point nationally, which is within a point or so of what ended up being the case, and a lot of other national polls.
If you look at the popular vote, she did win by a point. So you were actually right. It's just that that's not how elections in this country run. It's not a national public opinion poll. There's states involved, and there's the Electoral College.
Well, I think we also have a difficulty. I think as an industry, as pollsters, as pundits, as media forecasters, in talking about statistical and scientific uncertainty. And that's a really hard thing to kind of wrap your head around, because we are all fascinated with what's going to happen in the future. And certainly data can help predict what's going to happen or how people are going to behave, if in fact that behavior is something that can be reflected in the past. So we look at the past, we look at the present to try to generally predict the future. But there's only a certain probability that is going to happen. And I think in 2016, that really got lost, because it wasn't just about polls and looking at the margin of error, and we understand that as a range. Instead, we recalculated and averaged all the polls together and came up with this idea that somehow we were going to be able to predict this with a certain level of certainty, the 98% that Lee talked about, or the 71%. And that sounded like such a big number.
But why can't you do that if you just average all the polls?
Because in science, that kind of probability is something you actually shouldn't take stock in. If you have only a 71% probability that something is going to happen, yeah, it's likely to happen, but it's pretty close to 50-50. And so you wouldn't exactly want to, bet the house on that. or you wouldn't want to not take your umbrella if they say that it's...
Yeah, we're not weather people in all this. So if you see on the news that there's a 70% chance of it raining, you take an umbrella perhaps, and it doesn't rain and you don't get all that excited about it. But if you say there's a 70% chance that Hillary Clinton's going to be elected and she doesn't, well, that's really going to be the narrative gone awry.
Right, so
we've touted people in the wrong direction.
Is that wrong to even say, to even use polls in a predictive way? I mean, should that not have been something that people reported, that there was a percentage chance somebody was going to win?
Polls have a value.
We haven't heard that before.
Well, but yes.
That's not something, I don't remember in
well, this
prior
grew
elections.
This grew out of Nate Silver's 538 a couple elections ago, and everybody said in the media, the big guys, well, we got to get me one of them too. So now we had this avalanche, this proliferation of these forecasters trying to predict. But pollsters are in the business of measuring public opinion, not necessarily predicting
at a moment in time.
That's correct.
Not where it's going to be a month from now or a week from now.
Then we can analyze it and we can say what we think might happen as a result of where the polls are. But one thing we learned about 2016, unlike 2008 and 2012, this election was not baked in. There was a lot of movement at the end. In 2008 and 2012, when Barack Obama was elected and reelected, things didn't move that much. So we kind of had the perception, people did, that maybe things are locked in with the Clinton-Trump race as well. But in fact, the late deciders did break for Trump, and there were events, the Comey letter and other things that went on, such that the polls at the end, the quality polls, were picking up that movement. But again, the predictors, the forecasters were out there banging the drum on the fact that she was going to win. And that was a fault that is really a misguided part, because we should be telling a narrative, not necessarily giving probabilities, as Barb indicated.
So how much of this is the media's fault for being very, very surface? Now, I was a political reporter, so I'm as guilty of this as anybody. When a poll came out, I'm like, well, there's the hook for the story. I'm not going to go into great depth about all the ways that you polled and all the things you found out and all the asterisks around that. My headline's going to be, Jim is at 52%.
But why is
Judy's.
that? Why is that?
Because in television, I've got a minute 30 if I'm lucky, or if I'm sitting on a panel, it's got to move. The producer's in your ear going, move, move, move. We got to make this lively because people are sitting at home.
So how do we find a way to explain it?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think you do it through the media as it is today. I think that you do it for instance, in podcasts like this, or in other ways where you guys have the opportunity to explain what it means that this poll says this.
But numbers can be very deceiving because they look exact, and when they look exact, everybody thinks that they can understand what's behind that particular number. And I think one of the problems that has occurred as well is that we have this huge number of different types of polls that are now being used indiscriminately. Some of them are scientific, some of them are well done and are based on a scientific method, and others are actually done to kind of get into the mix and to get into the average so that they can affect that average, and they actually have...
There really are fake polls.
They really are fake polls, and I don't think we distinguish between them.
And the media doesn't either. And I think one of the morals of the story is we're going to have to kick the tires a little better, both on the media side and on the polling community side. We have a professional association.
Yeah, shouldn't that professional association be?
Yeah, but we're boring.
Yeah,
we're boring.
We're boring. I mean, pollsters are boring. We're going to talk numbers and why probabilities are this or that, and that's hard to be entertaining.
But it could be entertaining if you were to call out the bad boys and say this is a fake poll. Use the language of the current political climate and say that is a bogus poll because it's being done by people who won't reveal anything behind how their
transparency. That's really important. Yeah. Because if you're going to evaluate a poll, you need to understand that who they interviewed, who paid for the poll, what were the questions they asked. You need to be able to go to a place and make sure that you can find out everything about that poll. If you can't,
But you can't expect an audience. You can't expect me sitting at home watching, MSNBC or Fox News or whatever.
But a producer should be doing that. If they're going to be filtering the news for their audience, they should take the responsibility.
In a perfect world, that would be possible.
It comes back to consider the source, and that counts in law and it counts in journalism. You have to consider the source.
It's not tough. It's really going to Google and seeing if that organization has a website with that information. It's not a hard thing to do.
But here's one for consumers. So let's say you're sitting home watching TV, eating dinner, and the phone rings, or your cell phone, and it's a pollster. And you want to make sure that this is a legitimate, not a campaign poll, not a push poll. There's a lot of that stuff going around. Ask the person on the other end of the line, is there a number I can call back on to find out whether this is real or not? If the person then vanishes, you probably guessed right and it isn't. If the person says, well, you can call me at such and such number.
Toll free.
You probably got a real one. And you know what? Polls in the ideal are a chance not only to tell the narrative, but for people who have opinions to voice their opinions. So we find that people are very eager to say what they think. But in some polls, maybe that's being spun in ways that perhaps do, in fact, bias the results.
So how's 2018 going to be different?
Well, we're hoping that, as I said, the tires get kicked a little bit. I think there's going to be a little more caution separating out the good guys from the bad guys when it comes to polling. And I would think that,
can we make that one of our missions here at Poll Hub?
Oh, yes.
Absolutely.
Call out what's going on.
Absolutely.
In 2018.
And I think we will also see a pretty good chance that the media is going to be less intent on reporting these forecasters who they think were the pollsters. Well, maybe.
Every time you guys,
I disagree.
Every time you guys go on TV, you should be making sure that when the producer calls, and even when you're on and you're out the anchor, that you clarify that. Don't let the anchors control it.
The numbers are fun.
Yeah.
The numbers are fun, and no one can resist. And so I think we just need to be a little bit more wary. And I think as a profession, we need to be a little bit more energized in terms of getting that message out.
But most people think the polls had a bad time in 2016. They really didn't. The numbers really point that out, but we have to sort of separate out the good from the bad.
The wheat from the chaff, yeah. And also the fact that the national polls can only tell you so much when
it's a state
like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, that's actually what ends up deciding an election.
Yeah, and I don't think the media is going to refrain from talking about polls in general as they come out. But I think one thing they can do is perhaps invest in better polling.
All right. I have regained a little bit of my faith in institutions and especially in the polls because of this episode. Thank you.
We will show you the secret handshake after the program.
That worries me a little bit, but I'm slightly excited as well. So one of the things that we say every week and want to make sure you guys do is we want to hear from you. So send any questions you have about polls, anything to do with polls, political polls or otherwise, any questions you have, anything you're interested in, to Poll Hub, all one word, at Marist edu, edu for education, because we like to be educational. And check out Poll Hub on social media, at Marist Poll on Twitter, Marist Poll on Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, and subscribe. Subscribe. This way you get us every week.
And we're happier.
And we're what?
We're going to be happier.
Well, hopefully everyone is happier for that. That's it. See ya. See you next week.
Yep.